Vernon Slade didn't knock. He never did. The kitchen door swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and every man at the long supper table looked up from his plate. Vernon stood in the doorway like he owned the ground he was standing on, and the ground around it, and probably the sky above it too. He was broad, well-fed, wearing a coat that cost more than most of these cowboys made in a season, and he was looking directly at Maren. Not at Callum, not at the foreman. At her. You. He pointed like she was livestock that had wandered somewhere it didn't belong. Cook. Step outside. The men have real business to discuss. 15 cowboys went very still. Maren set down her ladle, slowly, deliberately. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she has already decided she is not afraid of him and wants him to know it. If you were sitting at that table, what would you have done? Well, before we go any further, if you've ever been dismissed, talked over, or told you didn't belong somewhere you had already bled for, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell on this channel don't end the way people expect. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, hit that like button so someone else who needs it can find it too. Now let's go back to Wyoming territory, because Maren Bellamy hadn't come all this way to be told to step outside. She had arrived at Iron Hollow Ranch on a Tuesday morning in late September, though she wouldn't have been able to tell you what day it was if you'd asked her. Days had stopped meaning much after the last town, after the last job that ended badly, after the last landlord who smiled too long when he said the room was almost affordable. She was 28 years old and she carried one suitcase. Not because she believed in traveling light, because that was all she had left. The wagon driver who brought her out from Millhaven didn't say much the whole 2-hour ride, which suited Maren fine. She sat with her suitcase on her lap, even though there was room to set it down, one hand resting on top of it, the way you rest a hand on something you can't afford to lose. She watched the Wyoming landscape open up around her, scrubgrass and rock and sky that went on longer than seemed fair, and she told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 3 years. Just get through today. Worry about tomorrow when it gets here. It wasn't wisdom. It was survival arithmetic, and she'd gotten good at it. The cook position at Iron Hollow had been advertised on a paper nailed to the post office board in Millhaven. Cook needed. Isolated ranch. 15 men. Wage offered. The handwriting was plain and practical. No flourishes. Maren had read it twice, pulled it off the board, folded it into her coat pocket, and walked to the general store to ask directions before she'd consciously decided to take it. Some decisions happen before you realize you've made them. She wasn't a trained cook. That was the truth of it, and she'd told the man who interviewed her, a weathered foreman named Hatch with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of a man who'd spent 40 years reading weather. Exactly that. She could cook. She'd been cooking since she was 9 years old for a household that expected a meal on the table regardless of what was or wasn't in the pantry. She could make something from close to nothing. She could feed people. Hatch had looked at her for a long moment. "You afraid of hard work?" he asked. "No." "You afraid of being the only woman for 30 miles? "I've been the only person for 30 miles before," Maren said. "It's quieter." He hired her on the spot. What he didn't tell her, what nobody told her, was that the previous cook had lasted 11 days. She found that out from a young cowboy named Pete on her first morning, when she came into the kitchen before sunrise and found it in a state that suggested the previous cook had left in some distress. The iron stove had a crack along the left side that someone had patched badly with old clay. The chimney drew smoke wrong, so the first 10 minutes of any fire filled the room with enough gray to make your eyes water. The water barrel needed refilling by hand from a well 40 yards from the kitchen door. The stores were low, lower than they should have been for a crew of 15 heading into October, and someone had let weevils into the cornmeal. Pete leaned in the doorway, watching her take all of this in. "The last fellow walked off," Pete offered. "Said it wasn't fit conditions." "What was wrong with the conditions?" Maren asked. Pete thought about it. "The smoke, the water haul, the stove, the cold at night, the men being—" He paused. "The men." Maren pulled on her apron. "Hold on. How do you take your coffee?" Pete blinked. "Black, ma'am." "Go get me 4 buckets of water, and I'll have it ready in 20 minutes. He went. She wasn't sure if it was because she asked or because he was genuinely curious whether she could do it, but he went, and that was enough. The smoke took some management. She learned the stove's character over that first hour. It ran hot on the right side and not nearly hot enough on the left, and the damper had to be held at a particular angle or the whole thing backed up. She burned her forearm on the right side of the firebox, learning this, a stripe of red that blistered before breakfast was over. She didn't say anything about it. She wrapped a damp cloth around it when she had a free hand and kept moving. She had flour, salt pork, dried beans, and 4 potatoes that had seen better days. She made biscuits and salt pork gravy with the potatoes fried on the side, and there was enough coffee to give every man 2 cups. The 15 cowboys filed into the long dining room at first light and sat down in the particular way of men who have made a habit of sitting together, a jostling, elbowing, chair-scraping wave of exhausted bodies that gradually settled into something almost orderly. They looked at the food on the table. They looked at her. Most of them said nothing. A few nodded. An older man named Gus, with hands like a pair of old boots, said, "Smells better than what Dawkins made." And that was apparently high praise, because several men around him grunted in agreement. Maren refilled coffee and went back to the kitchen. She didn't wait for further evaluation. It was during the second week that she first noticed Callum Rourke. Not because he stood out exactly. He wasn't the tallest man or the loudest. I didn't swagger, and he didn't make a point of being difficult the way 2 or 3 of the younger hands did. Testing her, she understood, without quite meaning to be cruel about it. He wore a faded brown coat that had been good quality once, and worked from first light to well past dark without complaint, and came to meals hungry in the way men get hungry when they've actually used their bodies for something. He was quiet, in a way that made other men speak more carefully when he was in the room. She noticed that. It wasn't that they were afraid of him. It was something more like respect, the kind that develops slowly over time and shows up in small gestures. Men moving slightly to make room, men listening when he spoke, men glancing his way before making a decision. She assumed he was a senior hand, possibly the ranch foreman, though Hatch already filled that role. Maybe a second in command of some kind. He came back for seconds one evening in the 3rd week, when she'd managed beef stew that was more bean than beef, but had enough depth of flavor that even Gus had cleaned his bowl twice. Callum paused at the kitchen doorway. Cowboys didn't generally come to the kitchen, they waited for food to come to them. And he knocked, which surprised her enough that she turned around. "You mind?" he said. He meant the ladle. He meant, could he serve himself? "Help yourself," Maren said. He did. He stood at the pot and served himself with the same quiet economy he seemed to apply to everything, and then he said, without looking up, "The juniper in there. How'd you think of that?" She'd found a handful of dried juniper berries in the back of a spice tin with no label. She'd added them on instinct, not sure if it would work. "Didn't really think about it," she said honestly. He looked up then. He had brown eyes, the kind that look almost amber in firelight, and he looked at her the way people look when they're evaluating something and trying to be honest about what they find. "It's good," he said. It sounded like he meant more than the stew. He went back to the table. Maren stood in her smoke-stung kitchen with her burned arm and her weevil-sorted cornmeal and thought, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she might stay a while. Then October turned and the sky went the color of old iron, and Iron Hollow Ranch began to come apart at the seams. The storm came without much warning, which the older hand said was not unusual for this part of Wyoming, but which still felt, in the experience of living through it, like being betrayed by something you'd trusted. 3 days of hard wind and driving snow that came in sideways and found every gap in every wall and piled itself against the buildings in drifts that changed the whole shape of the land. When it cleared, the damage inventory was discouraging. 2 fence lines on the north pasture were down. The barn roof had partially collapsed under the snow weight, leaving a gap large enough that the interior temperature dropped to killing cold. 40 head of cattle had drifted north following the storm and were somewhere in the hills that nobody could currently reach because the trail was blocked. The supply wagon wasn't due for 3 weeks, and there was no way to get word to Millhaven in the meantime. The men gathered in the dining room that evening, mud-frozen and exhausted, and the discussion got heated. A big red-faced cowboy named Denton, who was not the worst man on the ranch but was certainly the loudest, put both fists on the table and said they needed to cut losses. Let the northern herd go. Reduce rations to half so the food lasted through winter. Maybe send 2 or 3 men off to find work in town and come back in spring. Several men nodded, not because they thought it was a good plan, because they were tired and the math seemed to add up. Maren stood in the kitchen doorway listening. She didn't plan to say anything. She was the cook. Ranch decisions weren't her business, and she'd learned in enough other situations that inserting herself into other people's business was how you ended up out on the road again. But the math was wrong. She'd been running the numbers in her head for 2 weeks, quietly, in the mornings before anyone else was up, because it was her nature to know what she was working with and what she had left. She took one step into the dining room. "The math doesn't work," she said. 14 men turned to look at her. Denton stared. "Having rations means men working at half strength," she said. "You can't fix fences, find cattle, and repair a barn roof on half strength, especially not in cold like this. You'd lose more cattle to exposure and damage than you'd save on the food." Denton's jaw tightened. "With respect, ma'am, I'm not finished," Maren said. Something in her voice made him stop. She wasn't sure what it was. She wasn't performing confidence. She was just stating fact. And apparently that had a particular quality when it came from someone who wasn't used to being listened to but had done the math. She told them what she'd figured out. The stores weren't as low as they looked if you knew how to work them. She could stretch the dried beef with beans and grain and render the fat scraps for fuel so they burned less wood. She'd been saving vegetable trimmings for a broth base that most cooks threw out. There was enough. Not comfortably, not pleasantly, but enough. If nobody wasted anything, and she managed it carefully. 15 men would eat through a Wyoming winter. The room was quiet when she finished. Callum, who had said nothing during Denton's speech, looked at her across the long table. He nodded once. It wasn't much. It wasn't applause. But in that room, from that man, it meant the motion was carried. That was when Maren understood that she had misjudged the situation, that she had not simply been hired to cook at Iron Hollow Ranch. She had, somehow, become part of it. She wasn't sure yet whether that terrified her or not. She went back to the kitchen. She added up the numbers one more time to make sure she was right. She was. She put more wood in the stove and started tomorrow's biscuits. Then the kitchen door swung open hard enough to crack against the wall, and Vernon Slade walked in like he owned the place. He looked around the dining room at the 15 men, then at the simple table, then at Maren standing in the kitchen doorway with her apron and her flour-dusted hands. "Which one of you is in charge here?" he said. Not meanly, exactly, just with the absolute comfort of a man who had never, in his entire life, had to wonder whether he was welcome somewhere. "I am," Hatch said from the far end of the table. "I need to speak to the owner." Slade said it the way men say things when they know the answer already and just want everyone in the room to know they know it. "He's away on business," Hatch said, which was something that seemed to land as expected on most of the men at the table, and which Maren filed away without quite knowing why. Slade moved on without missing a beat. He had cattle of his own, he said, to the north. A bigger operation. More money. He'd ridden over because he was a neighborly man. He used that word with a particular emphasis that made it mean the opposite. And he had a business proposition. He wanted the western grazing land, the long strip along the creek that was currently underwater and wasn't doing Iron Hollow any practical good in this storm anyway. In exchange, he'd provide enough supplies to see the ranch through winter and throw in the labor to fix the barn roof. It sounded, on the surface, like a reasonable offer. Maren knew it was not a reasonable offer. She had walked that western land 2 weeks ago, following the creek to understand the water situation. That land wasn't just grazing, it was the watershed for the pasture that sat below it. Give Slade control of that strip, and he controlled where the water went, which meant he controlled the grass, which meant within 2 or 3 years he controlled Iron Hollow without ever having to buy it outright. But she was the cook. She kept her mouth shut for approximately 4 minutes. "That land isn't available," she said. Slade turned to look at her the way a man turns when an inanimate object makes a noise. Slow, mildly incredulous. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I cook here," Maren said. "That land isn't available." Something shifted in his face. A recalibration. He had dismissed her as furniture and she had declined to be furniture, and men like Slade found that deeply inconvenient. "With respect," he said, and the way he said it made clear that respect was the furthest thing from his mind. The kitchen help doesn't negotiate land deals. He turned back to Hatch. Hatch was looking at the table. Denton cleared his throat. Maren thought of the drive out from Mill Haven, the empty road, the long sky, the suitcase on her lap. She thought of how many times she had backed down in her life and where it had gotten her. The water runs downhill from that creek, she said, clearly enough for every man in the room to hear. Whoever owns that land controls where it goes. You give Mr. Slade that strip, and by summer he'll have a ditch redirecting water to his property. By next winter, your western pasture is dry. You're not selling grazing land, you're selling the ranch. The room was very quiet. Vernon Slade looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't have any warmth in it. "Cook," he said, "I strongly suggest you go back to your pots." Maren Bellamy looked at Vernon Slade and thought of every man who had ever looked at her exactly like that. Like she was temporary, like she was manageable, like she was something that could be moved out of the way. She thought of all the times she had let them be right. She didn't move. Callum Rourke, who had sat through this entire exchange without speaking a word, set his coffee cup down on the table with a quiet, final sound. Everyone heard it. "She's not wrong about the water," he said. He wasn't looking at Slade when he said it. He was looking at his cup. Slade's smile didn't disappear. It just changed into something harder underneath. "I'll come back," he said pleasantly, "when the owner's available." He left. The room stayed quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then Pete, young Pete, who'd hauled her 4 buckets of water on the first morning and had been watching the whole scene with his mouth partly open, said, to nobody in particular, "He's going to come back meaner." "Yes," Maren said. She went back to the kitchen. She started the next calculation. There was, she had noticed on her walk along the creek, an old irrigation trench behind the western ridge, partially caved in, long abandoned, and the creek was rising from snowmelt faster than anyone was paying attention to. She turned that over in her mind while she stirred the pot. Just get through today. But for the first time in years, she was also thinking about tomorrow. Nobody said anything to Maren after Slade left. Not that evening, anyway. The Cowboys filed out of the dining room the way men file out of a space where something uncomfortable has happened, quickly, without making eye contact, as if the air itself might ask them to take a position they weren't ready to take. Denton was the last one out, and he paused at the door long enough to give Maren a look that she couldn't quite read. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't grateful either. It was the look of a man who had been wrong about the math and knew it, and wasn't entirely sure how he felt about the person who'd corrected him. He left without saying anything. Maren washed the dishes. This was, she had decided early on, the best time to think. The physical work of it, the scrubbing, the rinsing, the stacking, occupied just enough of her hands to free up the rest of her mind. She thought about the creek. She thought about the old irrigation trench she'd seen on her walk, half buried under decades of sediment and collapsed earth, running along the base of the western ridge like a scar. She thought about water and where it went when nobody directed it. She also thought about Callum Rourke. She's not wrong about the water. 4 words. That was all he'd offered. But in that room, at that moment, 4 words from that particular man had shifted something in the air that Slade's entire confident presentation had not managed to shift. The Cowboys hadn't agreed to reject Slade's offer because Maren laid out the argument. They'd agreed because Callum had quietly confirmed it, which meant Callum carried more weight on this ranch than a regular hired hand. She filed that away and kept washing dishes. Outside, the wind had settled into the particular low moan that meant it wasn't done yet, just pausing, reconsidering, gathering itself for another run. She could hear it along the roofline. The kitchen was warm enough if you stayed close to the stove, but the far corner where the wall met the floor had developed a draft she'd stuffed with a folded feed sack, and the feed sack needed adjusting every morning because the wind worked it loose overnight. She adjusted it now, added 2 more pieces of wood to the fire, made a note in her head about the wood supply. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and the back of a flour sack and wrote down every item in the storeroom from memory, working through it methodically, the way her mother had taught her when she was too young to understand why it mattered and old enough to do it anyway. The numbers, when she added them up, were not comfortable, but they weren't impossible. There was a difference between those 2 things, and Maren had learned to live in it. She was still sitting there when the kitchen door opened, knocked first this time, she noticed. And Callum Rourke came in out of the cold with snow on his coat shoulders and a question he hadn't figured out yet how to ask. She could tell by the way he stood in the doorway for a second too long. "Coffee's still warm," she said without looking up from her flour sack. He came in, poured a cup, and sat down across from her at the table. She kept writing. He drank his coffee. The stove popped. The wind moved along the roof. After a while, he said, "The trench you were thinking about." She looked up. "How did you know I was thinking about a trench?" she said. "Because you mentioned the water running downhill, and then you got that look," Callum said, "like you were following it somewhere in your head." Maren put the pencil down. "There's an old irrigation channel behind the western ridge, probably 20-30 years old, mostly caved in." "I know it," Callum said. "The creek is rising faster than anyone's noticed. Snowmelt coming down from the north face." She tapped the flour sack. "If that water gets directed right, it could run into the sheltered lower pasture instead of spreading out and freezing in the low ground. You'd have water for the cattle you've still got, close enough to the buildings to manage, and you wouldn't have to chase the northern herd in conditions like this." Callum was quiet for a moment. "That trench would need a lot of work," he said. "Yes. Men are already stretched thin. I know that. And if it doesn't work, you've used up manpower that could have gone toward the barn roof or the fence lines." "I know that too," Maren said. "I'm not saying it's without risk. I'm saying the alternative is waiting and hoping, and winter doesn't wait." He looked at his coffee cup. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not disagreement, not agreement, something more like recognition. Like she'd said a thing he'd already been thinking and hadn't quite let himself commit to yet. "How long have you been running those numbers?" he asked. He meant the flour sack. "Since the second week," she said. He looked up. "You've been tracking the stores since your second week here?" "I track what I'm working with," Maren said, and there was no defensiveness in it. It was just fact. "I grew up in a house where we didn't always have enough. You learn to count." Callum looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then looked back at his cup. "I'll talk to Hatch in the morning," he said. He finished his coffee, rinsed his cup in the basin the way none of the other cowboys did, and went back out into the dark. Maren sat with her flour sack and her numbers. She told herself it didn't mean anything, the cup rinsing. Men could have decent habits without it meaning anything. She picked up her pencil and went back to counting. The conversation with Hatch did not go smoothly. Hatch was a practical man, which was mostly a virtue and occasionally a significant obstacle. His practicality meant he'd managed Iron Hollow's day-to-day operations for over a decade without a serious disaster, which was no small thing. It also meant he had very little patience for plans that hadn't been proven, and the irrigation trench plan had not been proven by anything except Maren's arithmetic and Callum's apparently quiet endorsement of it. "It's a gamble," Hatch said, the morning after Slade's visit, standing in the yard with his breath-making clouds in the cold air, and his expression making clear that he regarded gambles roughly the same way he regarded rattlesnakes. "Everything's a gamble right now," Callum said. He was leaning against the fence with his arms crossed, speaking in that measured way of his that somehow didn't sound like arguing even when it was. "What happens if we pull 4 men off fence repair to dig that trench, and it doesn't connect, right? We've lost fence time, and we've got a ditch that goes nowhere." "Then we fix it," Callum said. "With what time?" "Hatch." Callum said his name the same way he'd set his coffee cup down the night before, with a quiet finality that closed the question without quite slamming it. "Walk me through what happens if we do nothing." Hatch walked him through it. It wasn't a pretty walk. Without reliable water access near the buildings, the remaining cattle would have to be driven daily to the creek crossing, which was manageable in normal weather and murderous in a storm. The barn gap was losing livestock body heat, which meant animals were burning calories staying warm instead of keeping weight on. The northern herd was still out there, 40-some head scattered in the hills, and every day of cold made them harder to recover. By the time Hatch finished his own assessment, the trench idea sounded less like a gamble and more like the least bad of several bad options. "Fine," Hatch said. 4 men, 3 days. If it's not working in 3 days, we pull them back." He walked away. Callum looked at Maren, who had been standing slightly behind him and to the left because she hadn't been invited to this conversation, and had attended it anyway on the logic that it was about her idea and she had information that might be useful. 3 days, he said. "That should be enough if the upper section isn't too caved in," she said. "And if it is? Then we dig faster." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Not the full thing, just the edge of it, The suggestion that a smile was somewhere in the vicinity and might make an appearance if conditions were right. He went to organize the crew. The 4 men assigned to the trench were Pete, a quiet Texan named Arlo, a broad-shouldered man everyone called Brick for reasons that appeared to be self-evident, and a young hand named Colum, who was 17 years old, enthusiastic about everything, and not yet experienced enough to know when to be discouraged. Maren was not assigned to the trench. She showed up at it anyway on the first morning with coffee and biscuits, having gotten up an hour earlier than usual to have both ready before sunrise. And after the food was gone, she stayed and looked at the upper section of the trench and said to Pete, "The cave-in starts about 20 yards up. If you dig from both ends toward the middle, you'll meet somewhere around that bent willow." Pete looked at the willow, looked at the trench, and looked at Maren. "How do you know where the middle is?" he asked. "I walked it," she said, "last week." "In that cold?" "I was curious," Maren said, and went back to the kitchen. She came back at noon with food. She came back at mid-afternoon with more coffee and a suggestion about the angle of the second section that she'd worked out in her head while making bread, which Arlo initially rejected and then quietly implemented an hour later when he looked at the slope and realized she was right. She did not say anything about that. By the end of the first day, they'd cleared the lower third of the trench. By the end of the second, they'd reached the cave-in. The middle section was worse than Maren had estimated. Not significantly worse, but enough to make the 3-day timeline feel optimistic. Brick pulled out a rock the size of a steamer trunk that had been sitting in the trench for what looked like decades, and everyone stood there for a moment looking at the hole it left. "That's the problem," Colum said, with the impressive confidence of someone who'd had nothing to do with finding the problem. "That was the problem," Arlo said. "Now dig." They dug. Maren fed them and thought about water and watched the sky, because the sky had been doing something in the northwest that she didn't entirely like, a particular kind of gray that sat low and flat and still, the color of iron that's been left in the cold too long. On the evening of the second day, she told Callum about the sky. They were in the kitchen again, which had become the place where conversations happened that couldn't be had easily in the open. He'd come in for coffee. It had become a habit, his end-of-day cup. And she was working on tomorrow's bread, and they'd developed the kind of working quiet that 2 people develop when they've spent enough time in the same room that silence doesn't need to be filled. "There's weather coming," she said. "Maybe 2 days out, maybe less." Callum stood at the window and looked at the dark. "You sure?" "No," Maren said. "But I've been watching it all day, and it's not moving the way it should if it was passing north." He was quiet for a moment. "If another storm hits before the trench is done—" "I know," she said. "We need to pick up speed tomorrow." "I know that too." He turned from the window and looked at her. She was flouring the breadboard, her hands working automatically, not looking up. "What made you stay?" he said. It wasn't what he'd meant to say. She could tell. It came out from somewhere else, somewhere more honest than the conversation they'd been having. Maren kept working the dough. "The job needed doing," she said finally. "The last cook left in 11 days." "The last cook didn't make it to 11 days the way I'd have done it," she said, and there was no arrogance in it. Just a particular kind of settled certainty, the kind that doesn't come from confidence about the future, but from having already survived more than people expected. Callum looked at her for a moment longer. "The first morning," he said, "when you burned your arm on the stove. Hatch saw it at dinner and didn't say anything to you." Maren looked up. "I noticed," Callum said simply. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She put it somewhere practical and kept kneading bread. "Go get some sleep," she said. "If the weather's coming in, tomorrow's going to be longer than today." He went. She put the bread to rise and sat down at her kitchen table and thought about a man who noticed things and didn't announce that he'd noticed them, and then she told herself firmly that she had water tables to think about and went to bed. The third day started wrong. Colum slipped in the trench at first light and twisted his ankle badly enough that Brick had to half carry him back to the ranch, which left 3 men on the digging and put them behind by mid-morning. Hatch came out to assess and stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight and said, "We're not going to make it today." "We'll make it," Pete said. He was knee-deep in mud and his voice had the particular flat stubbornness of a man who has committed to a thing and intends to see it finished regardless of what the world thinks about that. "You've still got 15 feet of middle section," Hatch said. "Then we'd better dig faster." Hatch looked at the sky. He looked at the unfinished trench. He looked at Pete, who was already digging again, and Arlo beside him, and Brick, who had come back after delivering Column and picked up his shovel without being told. "I'll send 2 more men," Hatch said, and walked away before anyone could respond. Maren heard this secondhand from Pete at lunchtime, when she brought food to the trench because she'd decided they didn't have time to walk back to the kitchen and eat and come back. She set the pot and the biscuits on a flat rock, and they ate standing up, all 5 of them, mud to the waist, not talking much. After a while, Pete said, "You think this is going to work?" Maren looked at the sky. "Yes," she said. "How sure are you?" She picked up the empty coffee tin. "Sure enough to have gotten up at 4 in the morning for 3 days." Pete looked at her, and something in his young face shifted into something older and more decided. "All right," he said, and went back to digging. She went back to the kitchen and started on the evening meal and tried not to watch the sky. By late afternoon, the trench was nearly done. Nearly. There was a section at the upper junction, where the channel was supposed to meet the diversion point on the creek. That wasn't cutting right. The angle was off by something small enough that Arlo almost missed it, and significant enough that if they connected it wrong, the water would slide sideways into the low ground instead of running down toward the pasture. They lost an hour on that section. Maren knew because she'd walked back out at 3 o'clock to check progress, and stood at the junction with her hands in her coat pockets, calculating angles in her head the way she used to calculate how many portions a single chicken could make when there were 8 people at the table. "It's going the wrong way," she said to Arlo. Arlo looked at the channel. I was a quiet man, slow to speak and slower to change course once he'd started something, but he was also honest enough to look at what was in front of him. "By how much?" he said. "Enough," Maren said. "You need to take the left bank down another 6 inches and redirect from about here," she pointed. Arlo looked at where she was pointing. He looked at the sky. He looked at the amount of work left. He didn't say anything. He just adjusted his grip on the shovel and started taking the left bank down 6 inches. Nobody made a thing of it. That was the moment, Maren thought, not in words, but somewhere under words, that she understood she had actually become part of this place. Not because anyone had said so, but because a man with 30 years of ranch experience had just moved his shovel based on her arithmetic and hadn't needed a reason beyond the fact that her arithmetic had been right before. The junction was corrected by 4:30. They connected the upper channel to the creek diversion point just as the light was starting to go flat and gray, and the wind was picking up from the northwest with that particular cold edge that means the sky was done deliberating. Pete straightened up from the last section of trench, his back making an audible protest, and looked at what they'd built. "Open it up?" he said. Maren looked at Callum, who had ridden out to the site an hour ago and had been standing at the upper end of the trench watching without interfering, which she was beginning to understand was a habit of his, showing up, watching, deciding when something needed his weight and when it didn't. He nodded. Arlo moved the flat rock that was serving as a temporary dam on the creek diversion. They all stood back. For a moment nothing happened, and Maren's stomach dropped with the particular sick certainty that she had been wrong after all, that the angle was still off, that the water was going somewhere else. Then it came. Not a rush. More like a decision the water made reluctantly, a slow movement that became less slow. A trickle finding the channel, and then the channel doing what channels do when water finds them. It moved. It ran down the trench, hitting the junction point, and then, it went right, exactly the way the angle was supposed to direct it, and continued down the slope toward the lower pasture. Pete made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and the kind of exhale a person makes when they've been holding a breath for 3 days. Brick stood there with his hands hanging at his sides and watched the water move and said, with deep feeling, "Well, I'll be." Arlo didn't say anything. He put his shovel over his shoulder and started walking back toward the buildings. Maren watched the water run. She was cold, and her boots were wet, and she'd been awake since 4 in the morning, and her hands were red from the cold and rough, from the work she wasn't supposed to have been doing but had done anyway. She watched the water find its way down the trench and thought about all the things that could have gone wrong, the angle and the timeline and the cave-in and the twisted ankle and the 3 days of difficult calculations and the hours of watching the sky. She felt a hand close briefly around her elbow. She looked over. Callum was standing beside her, and the touch was there and gone quickly. Practical, not intrusive, like someone steadying a person who'd been standing on uncertain ground for a long time. "Good call," he said. That was all. She nodded. The crew walked back to the ranch in the failing light, 5 muddy, exhausted men and 1 woman who'd never officially been assigned to the project. Nobody said much. The wind was picking up. The sky was going dark in a way that meant business. Maren went straight to the kitchen and started the stove and got water heating and had coffee ready before the men had pulled off their boots. She made a beef and bean stew so thick you could stand a spoon in it, and biscuits that came out better than usual because the dough had had extra time to rest, and she set it all on the long table and stood back and let the men come in and eat. She didn't eat with them. She rarely did. She ate in the kitchen, at her own small table, usually from what was left. Tonight Callum came into the kitchen while she was eating and sat down without asking, which was different from the way he usually asked, or at least paused at the doorway. She looked at him. "The weather's going to hit tomorrow," he said. "Tonight," she corrected. "Late." He accepted the correction. "You should sleep while you can." "I'm eating," she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "When the trench was done, when the water started moving." He paused, which was unusual for him. He was careful with words, but not usually slow with them. "You didn't look relieved. You looked like you expected it." Maren thought about that. "I expected it to work," she said. "I wasn't sure it would." "That's a distinction." "It's the only one that matters," she said. "If I hadn't thought it would work, I wouldn't have spent 3 days trying to make it work. But thinking it would work and knowing it would work are different things. And if you can't hold both of those at the same time, you'll either never start anything or you'll never be honest about the risk." Callum looked at her. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "Childhood," she said simply, and ate her stew. He stayed and drank his coffee. She didn't mind. The storm hit at 2 in the morning. Maren heard it come in, first the wind picking up outside her small back room, then the sound of something loose on the barn roof slamming repeatedly in the gusts. Then the particular heavy silence that comes just before snow starts falling hard, and the whole world goes muffled and strange. She lay in her narrow bed and listened and ran through her checklist. Wood was stocked inside the kitchen. Water barrels were full. She'd made sure of that yesterday. The bread was baked. Dried meat was secured. The new channel. She thought about the channel, and whether the storm would affect it, whether the water was still moving or had frozen in the night, whether she'd need to check it at first light, or whether it could wait until the storm passed. She decided it could wait. She was asleep within 10 minutes. At dawn, the storm was still going, and the world outside the kitchen windows was white in every direction. The men came in for breakfast in shifts because the barn needed attention. The gap in the roof was letting snow pile in on the animals. And Maren kept the stove going and the food moving and the coffee hot, and tried not to think about the fact that they were now into their 4th week of genuine hardship, with no clear end in sight, and the supply wagon still 2 weeks away. She didn't allow herself to think about it for long. That was the trick, she'd learned. You could acknowledge something was bad. You should acknowledge it, because pretending it wasn't bad just meant you weren't doing the math right. But you couldn't live in it. You acknowledged it. You calculated what you could do about it, and then you did that thing and moved on to the next calculation. She was on her 3rd pot of coffee when Hatch came in shaking snow off his coat and looking like a man carrying news. "Creek's up," he said. Maren turned from the stove. "How far up?" "It's topped the south bank, moving toward the low ground west of the barn." She thought fast. "The trench? Is the water still running through it?" "Far as I can tell. But if the creek keeps rising, it might not matter. The overflow's going to go somewhere, and I don't love where it's heading." Maren untied her apron. "Where are you going?" Hatch said. "To look at it," she said. "It's a blizzard out there." "I'm aware," Maren said, pulling on her coat and her boots and her hat and wrapping her neck in a feed sack she'd been using as a scarf since hers had worn through. Hatch gave her the look of a man who has decided that arguing would take longer than whatever was about to happen. She went out. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. She put her head down and walked. The creek had risen significantly overnight. She could see it before she reached the bank. The south edge had overflowed into a thin moving sheet that was spreading across the low ground toward the barn's western wall. Not a flood. Not yet. But it was moving with the unhurried persistence of water that has decided it's going somewhere and intends to get there. She followed the edge of the overflow, moving east, looking for the point where the bank was lowest. She found it about 30 yards upstream from the barn. She also found something else. the old drainage ditch that ran along the barn's north side. She hadn't paid much attention to it because it hadn't seemed relevant until this exact moment. Ran east toward a natural depression in the land, a low bowl about 50 yards across that ended at a rocky shelf. If you got the overflow moving into that ditch instead of toward the barn, the water would go into the depression and sit there harmlessly until it could drain or freeze. The problem was a section of bank that needed breaking, needed redirecting, and she was standing there alone in a blizzard with no tools. She went back to the barn. She found Pete and Brick sheltering the animals from the snow coming through the roof gap, working with the exhausted competence of men who'd been doing hard things all week and had simply made peace with the prospect of doing more. "I need shovels," she said, "and I need both of you for about an hour." Pete looked at the barn gap above them, at the animals, at Maren. "What for, Sight?" he said. She told him. He handed the lead rope he was holding to Brick without looking away from her. "Get a shovel," he told Brick. Brick got two. They were out in the blizzard for an hour and 40 minutes. The bank section took longer than Maren expected because the ground had frozen overnight, and they were working with cold, stiffened hands. But Pete was stubborn in the particular way that kept him digging when other men would have stopped, and Brick was simply large enough that when he put the shovel into frozen earth, the earth moved whether it wanted to or not. When the bank finally broke, the overflow moved into the drainage ditch with the same grudging then decisive momentum that the trench had shown 2 days earlier. It ran. It found the depression. It spread out and slowed down and stopped being a threat. The western barn wall was safe. Pete stood in the blizzard looking at it. "You knew that ditch was there?" he said. "I noticed it when I went out to check the trench progress," Maren said. Her nose was running and her feet were wet inside her boots, and she was going to need to get warm or she was going to be genuinely useless for the rest of the day. "You just noticed it," Pete said. "I notice things," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read through the snow. "You walked the whole property, didn't you?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Maren didn't answer that. She picked up a shovel and headed back to the barn to return it, and Pete fell in beside her, and neither of them said anything else about it. But she heard him tell Arlo about it that evening at supper, in the low, specific voice men use when they're telling each other something they don't want to seem too impressed by. She was in the kitchen. She wasn't supposed to hear. She heard. She kept her face neutral and kept serving food and didn't let herself feel anything about it until later, when the kitchen was quiet and the stove was banked low and she was doing her end-of-day accounting at the small table, pencil moving across the flour sack. The numbers were still tight, but they were working. She had enough food to carry 15 men through another 3 weeks, possibly 4 if the next supply wagon came on time. The cattle near the buildings were watered. The barn was intact. The western pasture had water access. The immediate crisis, not resolved, not by any means. There was still a damaged barn roof and a scattered northern herd and a man named Slade who would absolutely be back. But the immediate killing crisis had been navigated. She put the pencil down. Outside the wind was still going, but it had shifted tone. Lower, steadier. A wind that's settling in rather than escalating. She thought about what Callum had said. "You looked like you expected it." She had expected it to work, yes. She'd also known that expecting something to work and needing it to work were dangerous things to mix together, because need made you cut corners on the math, and cut corners got people hurt. She had not cut corners. She had walked the property, noticed the ditch, counted the stores, watched the sky, gotten up at 4 in the morning, done the arithmetic twice, and then done it again. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing that made a story you could tell around a fire. It was just the sustained, invisible, daily work of someone who understood that paying attention was the difference between surviving a hard season and not. She blew out the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark and the stove warmth. She was tired in a way that went past the physical. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is only now beginning to notice the weight. She went to bed. She did not lie awake worrying. She had done what could be done today. Tomorrow would come with its own arithmetic, and she would do that too. But somewhere in the back of her mind, not quite a thought yet, more like the shape of one, she was aware that Vernon Slade was coming back. That a damaged ranch in a hard winter was exactly the kind of vulnerability that men like Slade watched for. That the creek and the trench and the emergency ditch had bought time, not safety. And that whatever came next was going to require more than careful numbers, and 4 in the morning and watching the sky. She fell asleep before she figured out what that more might be. The storm broke on the 5th day. Not gently. Wyoming storms didn't do anything gently. It simply stopped, the way a difficult conversation stops. Not resolved, just exhausted. And left behind a silence so complete that Maren heard her own breathing when she stepped outside that first clear morning. The world was white and still and brutal in the particular way of beautiful things that could kill you without meaning to. She stood in the yard for exactly 2 minutes, long enough to assess the sky and feel the temperature and decide that the cold had peaked and was beginning its slow, reluctant retreat, and then she went back inside and started breakfast because 15 men were going to wake up and need to eat, and the day wasn't going to organize itself. The damage inventory took most of that first clear day. It was worse than the storm after the first storm, which nobody said aloud because saying it would have made it more real, but everyone understood it. The barn roof gap had widened, the snow weight had finished what the first storm started, and a section roughly 12 feet across had given way completely, leaving the northeast corner of the barn open to the sky. 2 more fence sections were down on the eastern pasture. The supply trail, already blocked, was now buried under drifts that Pete estimated at 5 to 6 feet in the low sections, which meant the wagon couldn't get through even if it was already on its way, which it wasn't because it wasn't due for another 10 days. Hatch walked the property with a face like a man doing math he didn't like, and came back to the kitchen, not the dining room, the kitchen, which told Maren something about how serious the assessment was, and sat down at her small table with his hat in his hands. She put coffee in front of him without being asked. "Roof's the priority," he said. "We lose more cattle to that cold, we're in trouble that no amount of water management fixes." "How many men does the roof take?" Maren asked. 6. Maybe 7. To do it right. It's not a patch job anymore, it's a rebuild. That leaves 8 for everything else. 8 and call him, if his ankle's held up. Maren thought about the ankle. She'd been the one re-wrapping it every morning because Colum was 17 and had the injury management instincts of someone who believed that things healed faster if you ignored them. She'd made him stay off it for 2 full days, which he'd spent in the kitchen being underfoot and deeply unhappy about it, and by the 3rd day she'd allowed him limited movement, and by now he was walking with only a slight hitch. "Colum can do light work," she said. "Keep him off ladders." "That's not your call," Hatch said. Not unkindly, just stating it. "I know," Maren said. "I'm telling you what I know about his ankle." Hatch looked at her for a moment with an expression that had evolved considerably from the squinting assessment he'd given her on the day she was hired. He drank his coffee. "The stores," he said. "How are we sitting?" Maren pulled out the flour sack. She'd transferred her calculations to a proper piece of paper by now, folded and kept in her apron pocket. But the flour sack was where she'd started, and she still thought of it as the document that mattered. She walked him through the numbers. He didn't interrupt. When she was done, he looked at the paper for a long moment. "You've got us 2 weeks further than Dawkins would have," he said. Dawkins was the previous cook, the one who'd lasted 11 days. Hatch said his name the way you say the name of someone who tried their best, and it wasn't enough. "Dawkins didn't know what he was working with," Maren said. "That's not a criticism. He didn't inventory before he started, so he didn't know the baseline." "And you inventoried in your 2nd week?" "1st week," she corrected. "2nd day, actually. I wanted to know what I had." Hatch was quiet for a moment. The morning sounds of the ranch were starting outside. Boots on frozen ground, the creak of the barn door, someone calling something to someone else across the yard. "If the wagon comes on schedule," Hatch said. "We're fine," Maren said, "if it's late. We're tight, but manageable. If it's very late." Maren folded the paper. "Then we have a different conversation, but I don't see the point in having it before we know whether we need to." Hatch almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "You're practical," he said. "Most people who've been hungry are," she said. He put on his hat and went back out to organize the day. Maren stood at the stove and thought about the 10 days until the wagon and the barn roof and the northern herd that was still scattered somewhere in the hills, and the fact that Vernon Slade had not come back yet, and that the absence of him felt more threatening in some ways than his presence had. Men like Slade didn't give up. They reconsidered and waited and came back when conditions were worse. She started the biscuits and pushed Slade to the back of her mind. There was enough in the front of it to occupy her. The barn roof work started that morning and was immediately comprehensively miserable. Working at height in winter was its own particular kind of punishment. The wood was frozen and uncooperative. The men working the upper sections had to stop every 20 minutes to warm their hands enough to grip properly, which meant the work moved in short, cold bursts rather than any sustainable rhythm. Jus, the older man with the boot leather hands who'd been the first to say something approving about her cooking, was in charge of the rebuild and directed it with the economy of motion that came from decades of knowing exactly what he was doing, but even Gus couldn't make frozen lumber behave. By midday, 3 hours of work had covered perhaps a third of the gap. Maren brought food to the barn rather than making the men come in, because the time it took to come in, eat, and come back was time the daylight didn't have. She stood in the barn with the smell of hay and livestock and cold pine around her and watched the men on the upper structure eating with one hand and holding on with the other, and thought about how much a person could ask of other people before the asking became something else. Callum was up there. He worked the upper beam alongside Brick and a hand named Wallace, who had a carpenter's background and moved across elevated structures with the calm comfort of someone who'd spent years above ground level. Callum was not a natural at heights. She could tell because he was more deliberate than Wallace, more careful about his footing, but he was there and working and not complaining about it, which was, she was coming to understand, simply the way he operated. He came down at noon to eat and stood beside her for a moment. "We'll get it closed by dark," he said. He wasn't entirely certain of this. She could tell by the slight tension around the statement, the way it was said as a goal rather than a fact. "The cattle in the northeast corner need to move regardless," she said. "Even after the roof's patched, that wood is going to be cold and green. Move them to the south side tonight. They'll be warmer." "I'll tell Hatch." She handed him a biscuit. He took it and looked at her briefly. "You sleep at all?" "Some," she said. "Before the storm or during?" "Both. Don't make it a thing." He ate the biscuit and went back up. The roof was closed by 4:30, which was not dark but was close enough to dark that the light was unreliable, and Gus called the work done before someone fell off something trying to get the last piece seated right in bad light. It wasn't the cleanest patch job Gus had ever overseen, and he said so, twice, with the particular professional dissatisfaction of a craftsman who knows the difference between adequate and right. "It'll hold," Callum said. "It'll hold," Gus agreed, in a tone that meant it'll hold, and I'm not happy about it. The cattle were moved to the south side. Maren checked the drainage situation before she went in. The channel was still running, slower now that the storm had passed and the snowmelt had temporarily stabilized, but moving. The depression beyond the barn held a shallow frozen pool that hadn't gone anywhere problematic. She went inside and made supper and did her evening arithmetic and went to bed. This was the rhythm that the ranch had settled into. Not comfortable, not easy, but rhythmic in the way that hard things become when you've stopped fighting the hardness and started working with it. 4 days passed like this. The northern herd was still out there. That was the thing nobody talked about directly, but everyone thought about. 40-some head of cattle scattered in the hills, surviving or not surviving depending on what the storm had done to the grazing and the water sources up there. Hatch had sent 2 riders up on the first clear day, and they'd come back with a partial count, 26 animals located, moved to a sheltered draw, alive and in reasonable condition. That left somewhere between 14 and 20 unaccounted for. Maren noticed that Callum went quiet in the evenings when the northern herd came up in conversation. Not a different kind of quiet than usual, just pointed. Like he was carrying something specific about those animals that he wasn't sharing. She didn't ask. People had the right to carry things at their own pace. On the 5th day after the storm, Pete came in for breakfast wearing an expression that Maren had come to recognize as the look of someone with information he wasn't sure how to deliver. She put his coffee in front of him and waited. "Ryder came in from the East Road," Pete said. "Early, before sunrise. I was checking the fence line on that side." "Who was it?" "Didn't recognize the horse, but I recognized the brand." He paused. "It's Slade's." Maren kept her hands moving, kept working the dough she'd been working, but something in her chest went very still. "He didn't stop here," Pete continued. "Just rode past, heading north, toward the hills, toward where the northern herd was scattered." She thought about that. "Does Hatch know?" she asked. "Not yet. I came to get breakfast." "Go tell Hatch," she said. "Then come back and eat." Pete went. Maren kept working and thought about Vernon Slade riding north before sunrise in the direction of scattered, unaccounted-for cattle. She thought about it long enough to form a very clear picture of what that likely meant. Then she went to find Callum. She didn't usually seek him out. Their conversations happened in the kitchen, in the evenings, when he came to her. That was the established pattern, and she'd been comfortable with it. But this felt like something that needed to happen at a time she chose rather than waiting for the end of the day. She found him at the water trough, checking the channel intake, which he did every morning now. She'd noticed that he'd taken on this particular task as his own without anyone assigning it, which meant he'd been watching the channel the way she watched the stores. "Slade sent a rider north before sunrise," she said. Callum straightened up from the trough. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before, a quick, controlled tightening. He looked toward the northern hills. "He's going after the missing herd," he said. Not a question. "That would be my guess," Maren said. The missing cattle were on Iron Hollow land, technically, but scattered and unbranded and alone in the hills. And in Wyoming territory, cattle law was a practical thing. If you found unbranded strays, the question of who they belonged to could become complicated, especially if someone with money and connections decided to complicate it, especially if that someone had already made clear he wanted a piece of this ranch. "How long has he known?" Callum said. "I don't know, but he knew before this week or he wouldn't have sent a rider in this weather." Callum looked at the hills. Something moved behind his eyes. Not panic, because she was beginning to understand that panic wasn't available to him. It was just a thing he didn't do, but something urgent and decisive. "I need 3 riders," he said. "Now." "You need 4, Maren said. "The northern section splits at the ridge. One man can't cover both draws." He looked at her. "I walked it," she said simply. She had walked it 6 weeks ago, in the first week after she arrived, before anyone was paying her that kind of attention. She'd walked the entire accessible portion of Iron Hollow's land because she'd wanted to understand the place she was working in, the way she'd inventoried the kitchen stores, the way she'd watched the sky. Callum held her gaze for a moment. 4 riders, he said, and went to find Hatch. She went back to the kitchen. She spent the next hour in a state of focused practicality that was its own kind of anxiety management. If her hands were working, her mind couldn't spiral into the territory of what if this doesn't go right? What if Slade has already moved the animals? What if the ranch loses the northern herd on top of everything else? She made bread and portioned dried meat and restacked the grain bags that had shifted during the storm and tried not to count minutes. The riders left within the hour. Callum, Pete, Arlo, and Wallace, taking the 2 paths into the northern hills that Maren had described from memory, cold horses and colder air, and the particular men who understood what losing that herd would mean. Hatch stayed. He stood in the yard watching them go with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Maren brought him coffee. He took it without looking at her. "If Slade's men have already moved them off the land," he started. "Then you get a lawyer," Maren said. "But let's find out what's happened before we start figuring out what to do about it." Hatch looked at her. "You're calm," he said. It sounded slightly accusatory. "I'm not calm," Maren said. "I'm functional. They're different." He made a sound that acknowledged this distinction. They waited. Maren went back to the kitchen and kept working, and the hours moved the way hours move when you're waiting for news that matters. Too slowly, and then all at once. They came back at mid-afternoon. All 4 riders, plus what looked like, she counted from the kitchen window, 31 head of cattle moving in a rough group behind them, harassed along by Wallace on the far edge. Not 40, but 31. She met them in the yard. Pete's face told her something had happened before his mouth did. He had the expression of someone who'd been angry recently and hadn't finished processing it. "Slade's men were at the north draw," Callum said. He was dismounting and his voice was flat and controlled in the way of someone who has decided what register to operate in and is holding it there deliberately. 2 of them. They'd gathered 11 animals and were moving them east. "Your land?" Maren said. "Yes." He handed his horse to Callum, who'd materialized from the barn. "I told them to stop and they told me it was open grazing country. I told them the brands were Iron Hollow brands, and they told me the animals were unbranded." "Are they?" Maren said. Callum looked at her. "No, but they're winter brands. Smaller, on the left flank, hard to read if you don't know what you're looking for." He paused. "Or if you're pretending you don't know what you're looking for." "What happened?" Maren said. "They left," Callum said. Without the cattle. He said it simply, but she heard what was under it. She didn't ask how they'd been persuaded to leave without the cattle because she could see from the set of his shoulders and the way Pete wasn't quite meeting her eye that the persuasion had been of the direct physical kind, and she didn't need the details. What she needed to think about was what happened next. Because Slade's men leaving without the cattle was not the same as Slade accepting that he couldn't have them. She said this. I know, Callum said. He's going to come back with something more than 2 riders, she said. I know, Callum said again. And if he comes with county men or some kind of legal argument, Maren, he said her name, which was the first time he'd used her name and not ma'am or Miss Bellamy, and it stopped her. I know. I've been thinking about it the whole ride back. She nodded. He went inside. She stood in the yard for a moment in the cold and thought about men with money and patience, and she thought about what tools you used against them when the tools you had were a kitchen, a flour sack full of numbers, and 15 exhausted cowboys. Then she went inside too, because there was supper to make, and supper didn't wait. Next 2 days were quiet, in the particular way that things are quiet before they stop being quiet. The ranch ran its routines. The roof held. The channel kept flowing. The 31 recovered animals were settled into the south pasture alongside the ones who'd stayed close to the buildings. And the count was not what it had been before the storms, but it was workable. It was something to build from. Maren cooked and managed stores and watched the eastern road from the kitchen window without letting herself be obvious about it. On the 3rd day after the cattle recovery, she was in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn, building the fire and starting the coffee, when she heard something that made her stop. Voices. Outside. Not the voices of ranch hands going about morning business. These were coming from the wrong direction, from the front of the house, and there were too many of them, and they had the particular pitch of voices that are being held careful and controlled. She went to the front window. 3 wagons on the road stopped at the gate. 6 men on horseback. Vernon Slade in his expensive coat, sitting on his horse like he'd been waiting for a convenient morning to ruin. And beside him, a man she didn't recognize, older, in a black coat, with something about his bearing that said official in the way that money could make official things happen very quickly. The front door of the main house opened. Hatch came out. Then behind him, Callum. Maren put down her coffee and went to the door. She didn't go outside. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, which connected to the back of the main house by a covered walkway, and she listened. Slade's voice carried well in the cold. I'm here as a courtesy, he said. The word courtesy, in his mouth, was as thin as the ice on a spring puddle. Before county business becomes necessary, Mr. Aldridge here represents 2 buyers who are prepared to make a fair offer for Iron Hollow in its current condition. He paused, letting that land. In its current condition, meaning damaged, winter-stressed, herd-reduced, supply cut. Given the difficulties of the season, I thought it better to come directly rather than let the situation deteriorate further. Hatch said something Maren couldn't hear. Slade continued, louder, which meant Hatch had said something that required overriding. The brand dispute on the northern animals is still a matter that county officials can weigh in on. I'm not threatening that. I'm simply observing that it would be unfortunate if that process coincided with the spring assessment for Iron Hollow's grazing licenses. There it was. Maren understood it in a moment with the sharp, unpleasant clarity of someone who has been in enough difficult situations to recognize leverage when she sees it deployed. Slade wasn't just threatening to contest the cattle brands. He was threatening to create enough legal and administrative friction at exactly the wrong time, spring license assessment, when a ranch needed its paperwork clean and its land rights uncontested, that selling would look better than fighting. It was sophisticated for a man who presented as simply aggressive. She revised her estimate of him upward, which made him more dangerous. Callum spoke. His voice was level and clear, and it carried, and what he said was, I'm not interested in offers. Slade smiled. She could hear the smile even from where she was standing. The winter isn't over, Mr. Rourke, Callum said. It's Rourke. And then he said plainly, without inflection, I own this ranch, and I'm not interested in offers. The silence that followed was the kind that has shape to it. Maren felt something cold move through her that wasn't the weather. I own this ranch. She stood in the kitchen doorway and processed the things she'd just heard. Callum, who rinsed his coffee cup, who worked from first light to past dark in a faded brown coat. who had 4 words at Slade's first visit, who had quietly, consistently, been the weight in the room that other men oriented around without her quite understanding why. Callum Rourke owned Iron Hollow. She turned this over for about 15 seconds, which was how long she had before Slade started speaking again, and the situation outside became something that needed her attention. He owns it, which meant everything he'd done, working alongside his crew, eating at the long table, listening to Maren's arithmetic without identifying himself as the person whose ranch the arithmetic was protecting, had been a choice, a sustained, deliberate choice. She would deal with what she thought about that later. Right now, Slade was talking about county assessors. Maren pushed the door open and walked out into the cold. She didn't have a plan. This was the plain truth of it, and she recognized it even as she was walking, which was the most honest she'd been with herself in a while, about the difference between acting from calculation and acting from something more immediate. She walked through the covered walkway and out the front side and stood at Hatch's left shoulder. Slade's eyes found her immediately. They always did. She'd noticed this about him. He was a man who cataloged threats and ranked them by importance, and she had apparently moved up in his ranking since their first meeting. "Ah," he said. "The cook." "The brand on the northern animals," Maren said. "Winter brand, left flank, applied in the second week of September." She paused. "I was here in the second week of September. I saw it done." This was true. She had watched the branding from the kitchen window during her second week because she'd wanted to understand the operation she was feeding. Slade's smile didn't waver. "One witness," he said. 14, Maren said. "The entire crew was there." The man in the black coat, Aldridge, shifted in his saddle almost imperceptibly. "Brand disputes go to county review," Slade said. "Witnesses or not." "Then they go to county review," Maren said. "And the county review will look at the brand, and the brand is there. And the date it was applied is documented in the ranch record that Hatch maintains, because Hatch maintains every record this ranch has ever generated. Which means the dispute ends in Iron Hollow's favor and costs you filing fees and makes you look like a man who went after another rancher's cattle during a hard winter." She said it flat. Not hostile, factual. "That's a reputation problem," she said, "for a man who does business in this county." The silence had a different quality this time. Aldridge was looking at Slade. Slade was looking at Maren with the expression of a man who has picked up a rock and found something underneath it he did not expect. "You're the cook," he said again, but this time it sounded like a question he was asking himself rather than a dismissal he was delivering. "I'm the cook," Maren agreed. Callum said nothing. She felt him beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present, in the way he was present when things needed his weight without his voice. Aldridge cleared his throat. "Mr. Slade, perhaps a different—" "I heard her," Slade said. He hadn't looked away from Maren. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were the eyes of a man doing fast arithmetic about whether what he'd planned was still workable. He pulled his horse around. "The offer stands," he said, to the air somewhere between Callum and the gate. "When conditions change your mind, you know where to find me." He rode out. The wagons followed. Aldridge went last, and as he passed the gate, he glanced back once, not at Callum, at Maren, with an expression she couldn't entirely read and didn't have time to analyze. Then the road was empty. The yard was quiet. Hatch exhaled like a man releasing 3 weeks of held breath. Pete, who had apparently been standing behind Maren without her noticing, said, "Well." He seemed to feel this covered the situation. Maren turned and went back to the kitchen because the coffee was going to burn if she left it much longer, and burned coffee was a waste she couldn't afford. She was pouring the first cups when she heard the kitchen door and knew without turning who it was. She finished pouring, set the cups on the table, sat down. Callum sat down across from her. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Maren wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at the table. "How long?" she said. "Since the beginning," Callum said. "I've done it every season. New employees, I don't announce myself. I work alongside the crew for the first several months, and I understood the practice," Maren said. "I'm asking how long you've been doing it." 4 years. She nodded slowly. "And Hatch knows." "Yes." "And Gus, the men who've been here long enough," he paused. "New hires don't know until they've been here long enough that it doesn't change how they treat me, or until something forces the issue." Maren looked up at him. "Were you testing me?" she said. "No," he said, and the word was immediate and unqualified in a way that made her believe it. I wasn't testing you, I was... He stopped, restarted. When I inherited this ranch, I made a lot of decisions based on advice from people who were telling me what I wanted to hear. Because I was the owner. Because money makes people into mirrors. He looked at his cup. I don't want mirrors. I want to know what I'm actually working with. Who I'm actually working with. So you work alongside them. So I work alongside them, he said, and I learn whether they're honest before I have to find out the hard way. Maren thought about this. What did you find out about me? She said. He met her eyes. That you walked the whole property in your first week because you needed to know where you were, he said. That you inventoried the kitchen stores on your second day and have been running the numbers every night since. That you burned your arm on your first morning and wrapped it in a damp cloth and didn't say a word about it because saying something would have felt like asking for sympathy, and you don't ask for that. Maren was very still. That you have more practical intelligence than 3/4 of the men who've worked this ranch, he said. And that you used it to protect something you had no formal claim to, without being asked, without being paid extra for it, without... He stopped, looked at his cup. Without it seeming to occur to you that you didn't have to. I was living here, Maren said, eating here. The men I was feeding were depending on this ranch to pay their wages. I know, Callum said. That's the part I... He stopped again. This was unusual, she'd come to know. He was careful with words, but rarely struggled to find them. That's the part I needed to see, he said finally. Maren looked at him for a moment. She thought about the woman who had arrived with one suitcase and no intention of depending on anyone, and she thought about the fact that somewhere in the past 2 months, she had depended on this place in ways she hadn't planned and hadn't quite recognized until right now. She wasn't sure yet how she felt about that. I'm angry about it, she said. I want to be honest about that. All right, Callum said. Not because you kept it from me. I understand why you kept it from new people. She held her cup with both hands. I'm angry because I spent 2 months making decisions about this ranch, about the water, the stores, the channel, this morning, and every time I was calculating whether I was overstepping, whether I had any right to weigh in on things that weren't my business. And the whole time you were watching, she paused. It would have been useful to know I wasn't overstepping. Callum was quiet for a moment. You never hesitated, he said. I hesitated every time, Maren said. You just didn't see it. He absorbed this. You're right, he said. That was a cost I didn't factor in. I'm sorry for it. The apology was direct and without qualification, which was the kind of apology she had enough experience with the other kind to recognize and appreciate. She nodded. Outside, the ranch was getting on with its morning. Boots on frozen ground, voices across the yard, the creak of the barn door, the sounds of people who had work to do and were doing it. Slade will come back, Maren said, moving to what was practical because the emotional accounting could be done slowly over time, but Slade was an immediate problem. Yes, Callum said, not with the same approach. You named yourself and the land dispute is less effective now. What do you think he'll do? Maren thought about Aldridge, about the way the man in the black coat had looked at her on his way out. He'll wait for something we can't control, she said. He's patient. He's been patient. He knows winter isn't over and that we're still short on supplies and that the barn roof is holding but only just. She turned her cup in her hands. He'll wait for the next disaster and come in when we're too worn down to argue. Then we don't get too worn down, Callum said. That's easier said. I know. He stood up. But we're not starting from nothing anymore. We've got water, we've got shelter, we've got provisions that you've stretched further than anyone had a right to ask. We've got 31 northern cattle back in the south pasture. He picked up his cup and rinsed it. She noticed this, again, the same habit as always, unchanged by everything she now knew about him, and set it in the basin. We're still standing. We're still standing, Maren agreed. He went to the door, then paused. What you said this morning, he said, about the brand witnesses, the county reputation. He looked back at her. You didn't know any of that would land when you said it. No, Maren said. But it was true. And sometimes true is enough. He looked at her for a moment. Sometimes, he said, and went out. Maren sat at the kitchen table with the noise of the working ranch around her and thought about honest men and irrigation ditches and the particular arithmetic of survival. She pulled the paper from her apron pocket and opened it and added yesterday's consumption and tomorrow's estimate and looked at the balance. Still working, still manageable. She put it back and stood up and started on the morning biscuits. Because the day was not going to wait, and neither was the work, and the work was what had gotten them this far, and it was what would carry them the rest of the way. Outside, the sky was clear and cold and absolutely merciless, the way Wyoming was when it wanted to remind you what the conditions actually were. Maren looked at it through the kitchen window for exactly as long as it took her to assess the weather and decide it was going to hold. Then she looked back at the stove. There was a ranch to feed. The supply wagon came in 7 days late. Not 10, not 2 weeks, 7, which was both better than Maren had feared and worse than the stores comfortably allowed for. She knew the exact number because she'd been tracking the margin every morning for the past week, the way you track a fever, not obsessively, but with the steady, honest attention of someone who needs to know the number before it becomes a crisis rather than after. On the morning of the 6th late day, she'd made the call to reduce the bread ration by a third and stretch the bean supply with grain she'd been saving since October. She told Hatch. Hatch told the men. Nobody complained out loud, which said something about how the temperature of the ranch had changed since September. The men who doubted she'd last a month were now eating reduced portions without argument because they understood she knew something about margins that they didn't, and she'd been right enough times that the trust was simply there now, sitting at the table alongside them. Denton, the big red-faced man who'd put his fists on the table that first storm night and argued for cutting losses, was the one who brought her an extra armload of wood one evening without being asked. He set it beside the kitchen door and knocked twice and walked away before she could say anything. She stood in the doorway looking at the wood and understood that this was, in its way, a complete apology. She brought the wood inside and didn't mention it. The wagon arrived on a Thursday with the driver, a man named Garrett, full of apologies about the trail conditions and a load that was 80% of what had been ordered because 2 sacks of flour had gotten wet, crossing a swollen creek 3 days back and had to be abandoned. Maren stood in the yard and looked at the inventory and did the arithmetic in her head in about 40 seconds. "It's enough," she said. Garrett looked relieved. "I was worried you'd be in a bad way." "We managed," Maren said. She had a list ready. She'd written it 3 days before the wagon was due, updating it daily as the stores shifted, and she handed it to him for the next run. He looked at it and his eyebrows went up slightly at the specificity of it. "This is detailed," he said. "The last one wasn't," she said, meaning the wagon orders that had preceded her arrival, which had been general and imprecise in the way of people who hadn't counted recently. "I know what we need." Garrett folded the list and put it in his coat. He looked at the ranch, the patched barn roof, the cleared yard, the cattle visible in the south pasture, and then he looked at Maren with the expression of a man assembling a picture from scattered pieces. "Heard Slade came through," he said, carefully. "He did," Maren said. "Heard he left without what he came for." "He did." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "He won't like that." "I know," Maren said. "Help me unload." They unloaded the wagon and she cataloged and stored everything with the systematic efficiency she'd developed over months of doing this with less. And when it was done, she had the first genuinely comfortable sense of the stores she'd had since October. Not abundance, not even ease, but enough room that she could plan instead of just react, and planning felt like breathing room after weeks of holding her breath. She let herself have about 10 minutes of that feeling. Then she started thinking about what Slade was going to do next. The thing she'd said to Callum, "He'll wait for something we can't control," stayed with her. It was the most honest assessment she'd been able to make, and honest assessments were useful precisely because they told you where your vulnerability actually was instead of where you wished it wasn't. The vulnerability here was weather and time. Iron Hollow had survived the winter so far, but surviving and being stable were different things, and Slade would know the difference better than most. She thought about it while she cooked. She thought about it during her evening counts. She thought about it on the long, clear nights when the cold was so sharp outside her window that the stars looked wrong, too bright, like something was burning just beyond sight. She was thinking about it one evening when Callum came in for his coffee and sat down and said, without preamble, "Aldridge came back." Maren looked up from her paper. "Alone?" she said. "Alone. This afternoon, while you were reorganizing the storeroom." He paused. He didn't come as a buyer's representative. He came personally. What did he want? Callum wrapped both hands around his cup. He had a particular way of doing this when he was about to say something that required some care in the saying. Both hands, not one, like he needed the steadiness. He wanted to warn me, Callum said, about Slade. Maren waited. Slade has been talking to men on the county land board, Callum said. He's building a case that Iron Hollow's grazing licenses are irregularly documented. It's not true, but the board has 2 members who owe Slade favors, and he's apparently been patient about collecting on them. What does irregular documentation mean in practice? Maren said. In practice, it means they call a review. The review takes months. During the review, the licenses are technically in question, which means any buyer trying to purchase Iron Hollow would be buying contested land rights, which means no serious buyer would touch it, which means if I needed to sell for any reason during the review period, he stopped. You'd have to sell to Slade, Maren finished, because he'd be the only one willing to take the legal risk. At whatever price he chose to offer. Maren put down her pencil. Why did Aldridge warn you? She said. Because he's a lawyer and he's represented Slade for 6 years and apparently he has a line he doesn't cross. Callum's voice was neutral, which meant he was uncertain about this. Or he has his own interest that Slade's methods are threatening. I'm not sure which. Does it matter? Not for what he told me. It might matter for how much I trust it. Maren thought about Aldridge's face on his way out of the yard the morning Slade had brought him. The way he'd looked back at her. She'd read it as something at the time and filed it away. A discomfort, a man who was doing a job he wasn't entirely comfortable with. I think he meant the warning, she said. Based on? The way he looked when he left, she said. Some men wear what they're ashamed of on their faces if you catch them at the right angle. Callum looked at her. That's a specific observation, he said. I've had occasion to notice it before, she said simply, and didn't offer more, and he didn't ask. So, he said, the land board. So, Maren said, what does the documentation actually look like? Your licenses. Clean. I've been meticulous about it since I took over. Dates, acreage, boundaries, all properly recorded and filed. Then the review finds in your favor, she said, in 3 to 6 months. While my licenses are technically in question, and every rancher in the county knows it because Slade will make sure they know it. He paused. This is a business built on reputation and relationships. If other ranchers think my land rights are contested, they won't buy my cattle, they won't partner on drives, they won't— I understand, Maren said. She sat with this. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside the wind was doing something minor in the eaves, nothing threatening, just present. He's not trying to take the land anymore, she said slowly. Not directly. He's trying to take the ranch's standing, make Iron Hollow untouchable to everyone except him. Yes, Callum said. Which means the answer isn't legal, she said. Not entirely. You can fight the land board review and you'll win eventually, but the damage to the relationships happens in the meantime. Yes, he said again. You need the other ranchers in this county to see Iron Hollow clearly before Slade gets to define it for them. Callum was quiet for a moment. And how do we do that? Maren thought about it. She wasn't rushing the answer, and he wasn't pressing her for one, which was something she'd come to appreciate about conversations with him. He had the patience to let thinking happen at its own speed. Spring, she said finally. When do the ranchers in this county typically have their first contact with each other after winter? There's a sale in Mill Haven, last week of March usually, when the trails are clear enough for the drives. Everyone sends cattle. Everyone's there. That's 5 weeks, Maren said, give or take. Then you go, she said, and you bring every honest record you have, and you go as who you are, not as a hired hand. She looked at him steadily. And you let people see what Iron Hollow is in a hard year, because a ranch that survived what this one has survived in the past 4 months is a ranch people want to do business with. Callum was quiet. Slade's narrative requires Iron Hollow to look weak, Maren said, so don't look weak. We're not, he said, quietly. Certain. I know, she said, but it needs to be visible. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the firelight, and something settled in his face. Not relief, not quite, but the particular look of a man who has been carrying a problem alone for long enough that having someone to carry it alongside changes the weight of it. He finished his coffee, rinsed his cup. I'll ride to Millhaven next week, he said, to the county records office. Make sure everything is in order and filed where it's supposed to be before any review can be called. Take copies, Maren said, of everything. You sound like you've dealt with this kind of thing before, he said. Landlords, she said. It's a different scale, same principle. He nodded. He went to the door, paused. Maren. She looked up. He'd been using her name for 2 weeks now, since the morning Aldridge had come, and each time it still registered as slightly different from what she expected, like a note played in a key you hadn't been listening for. I'm glad you stayed past 11 days, he said. He went out. She sat with that for a moment, then she pulled her paper toward her and went back to the numbers. The next 5 weeks moved differently than the ones before had. Not easier, not by any standard that would have satisfied someone who hadn't spent the winter at Iron Hollow. The cold held deep into February, and the repair work was ongoing, and the daily work of feeding 15 men and managing a household on the edge of isolation was not a thing that got simpler with familiarity. But the character of the difficulty changed. Before it had been reactive, storm, damage, shortage, response. Now it felt more like building, deliberate, forward-facing. Callum rode to Millhaven and came back with his documentation in order and a meeting scheduled with the county land agent who handled the grazing licenses. The meeting was quiet and administrative and resulted in nothing dramatic, which was the point. Getting ahead of a problem before it became a crisis was less visible than solving it after the fact, but considerably less expensive. He told her about the meeting in the kitchen, of course, because that was where they talked, and she listened and asked 2 or 3 practical questions, and he answered them. And after he was done, they sat for a while in the working quiet that was its own kind of conversation. These evenings had become something she didn't analyze too closely because she suspected analyzing them would change them, and she didn't want them to change. What she noticed, instead of analyzing, was this. He talked to her differently than he talked to anyone else on the ranch. Not softer, not with any kind of false gentleness. More directly. Less filtered. The way people talk when they're not managing how they come across because they've decided the person they're talking to can handle the unmanaged version. She thought that was probably the most honest thing one person could offer another. She noticed also that he'd stopped pretending not to be watching her work. In the early weeks, when she'd caught him paying attention to something she was doing in the kitchen or in the yard, he'd redirect his gaze the way a person does when they've been caught at something. Now he just watched, openly, when there was something that caught his attention, and when she looked back at him, he didn't look away. She wasn't sure what to do with any of this. She was 28 years old and she'd learned very early that depending on anyone was how you ended up without options, and she'd organized her life around that principle with the thoroughness of someone who really means it. She'd kept herself mobile, kept her expectations managed, kept the suitcase ready, even when she wasn't planning to go anywhere. The suitcase was still under her bed. She thought about that sometimes. In the 3rd week of February, Callum's ankle gave out again. Not dramatically. He was moving a grain sack from one side of the storeroom to the other, a task that was well within what she'd cleared him for. And he turned wrong and went down and knocked over 2 months of careful grain organization in the process. He was sitting on the storeroom floor looking deeply embarrassed when Maren arrived, attracted by the sound of cascading grain sacks. She looked at the scattered sacks. She looked at Callum. Are you hurt? She said. No, he said, which she suspected was not entirely true but was true enough. Can you stand up? He could, with some care. She had him put weight on it and assessed the way it held. You're going to need to actually stay off this for 3 days, she said. Not my version of 3 days where you're back on it lightly by day 2. 3 real days. Callum's face did the thing it always did when she said this. A combination of frustration and the sheepishness of someone who knows they've earned the limitation. It's fine, he said. It's not fine, and you know it's not fine, and me telling you it's not fine for the 4th time apparently hasn't fixed the problem, so we're trying something different. She pulled a stool over. Sit there. You're going to help me resort everything you knocked over. Callum sat on the stool and helped her restack sacks from a sitting position, and after a while he said carefully, Miss Bellamy? Maren, she said. She'd given up on Miss around week 6. Maren. He was quiet for a moment. What did you do before here? Cooked, she said. Various places. Where? Places you haven't been, she said, not unkindly. Did you always know how to... He paused, searching for what he meant. All the water stuff, the counting, knowing what to do when things went wrong. Maren stacked a grain sack and thought about her answer. I knew how to pay attention, she said. The rest of it comes from that. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, she said. It's just not complicated either. You look at what's in front of you honestly, and you figure out what you have and what you need, and you do the math. Most people skip the looking honestly part. Calm thought about this. Why? Because honest looking tells you things you might not want to know, she said. It's easier to assume things are fine. And then they're not fine, he said. And then they're not fine, she agreed. He was quiet for a while, handing her sacks from the floor. Mr. Rourke looks at you, he said. Studiously offhand, the way 17-year-olds are studiously offhand about things they're actually very interested in. Maren didn't look up from what she was doing. People look at each other, she said. Not like that they don't, Cullum said, and had the sense to let the subject drop. Maren kept stacking. She was aware, in the complicated way that she was aware of most things she didn't want to think about directly, that Cullum wasn't wrong. And she was aware of what she did with that awareness, which was the same thing she did with all the awareness she found uncomfortable. She filed it somewhere practical and kept working. The practical present always had something that needed doing. The last week of February brought 3 days of relatively mild weather, which in Wyoming in February meant temperatures only 15 degrees below what would be comfortable anywhere else. And the crew used it to attack the outstanding repair list with the particular urgency of men who knew the weather was doing them a temporary favor and intended to get the most out of it. Maren noticed during this period that the character of the crew's relationship with her had shifted in a way she hadn't fully processed until she saw it all at once. Pete consulted her before making decisions about the food supply for day trips. Arlo asked her opinion on the timing of the barn repairs because he knew she watched the weather. Juss, who had offered the original approval of her cooking and very little since, stopped by the kitchen one afternoon while she was working and stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "You did good this winter," and then walked away. She stood at the stove for a moment after he left. She had been told she did good work before. Employers, usually. Landlords occasionally, before they found a reason to change the arrangement. It had never quite felt like this felt, which was something warmer and less transactional, more like being seen by people who'd been watching long enough to actually know what they were looking at. She went back to work before she could feel too much about it. The night before the Millhaven spring sale, Callum came into the kitchen later than usual. She was still up. She was usually still up, the evenings being her most reliable thinking time. Sitting with her paper and her pencil doing the calculations she'd been doing for months. Stores, usage, margin, what they had and what they'd need, and how much the spring cattle price would need to be to make the numbers work going forward. Callum sat down. He didn't get coffee. He just sat. She looked at him. He had something on his face she hadn't seen before, or rather, she'd seen the parts of it separately. The tiredness she knew. The particular set of his jaw when he was thinking about something difficult she knew. But the combination was different. You're worried about tomorrow, she said. I'm thinking about tomorrow, he said, which was his version of yes. The documentation is in order, she said. You confirmed it 3 times. The documentation is fine, he said. It's not the documentation. What is it? He was quiet for a moment. When I took over this ranch, I was 23 years old and I had no idea what I was doing, and I made decisions that cost money and hurt the operation, and it took 3 years to get it back to what my father built. He turned his cup in his hands, the habit of it even when the cup was empty. Every time I go to that sale, I think about those 3 years. Maren looked at him. This was the most he'd said about himself in one sustained piece since she'd arrived at Iron Hollow. She understood instinctively that it wasn't a habitual kind of disclosure, that it was costing him something to say it, and she didn't do anything with it except listen. And now you go with a ranch that's had one of the hardest winters in recent memory and is still standing and still has cattle to sell, she said. Yes, he said. Then what you should be thinking about tomorrow is what price per head you want to hold to, she said. And whether the north pasture grass is going to come back strong enough this spring to support increasing the herd by the number the summer sale would allow, because if it is, you want to be selective tomorrow about what you sell and what you keep. He looked at her. I've been thinking about that too, he said. What did you decide? And they talked through the cattle economics of the spring sale, the way they'd talked through water channels and store margins and barn roofs, practically back and forth, each one following the other's reasoning and pushing back when it needed pushing. She knew less about cattle markets than he did, and more about the current condition of the Iron Hollow herd than he probably expected, because she'd been watching the animals from the kitchen window and from her walks, and she'd formed opinions. He listened to her opinions. Around 10 o'clock, she said, "You should sleep. Tomorrow is long." "I know," he said, but he didn't move immediately. He sat there for a moment in the kitchen light, and she had the feeling he was working up to saying something and then deciding not to. He stood up. "Maren," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment across the kitchen table. The lamp was low. The stove was down to coals. Outside it was a clear, cold night with that Wyoming silence that had its own particular weight. "Whatever happens in Millhaven tomorrow," he said, "what you've done here this winter." He stopped. Started differently. "I want you to know I see it, all of it, not just the things that worked." She held his gaze. "The things that didn't work either," she said. "Yes." She nodded. Her throat felt tighter than she'd expected. "Go to bed," she said. "You've got a long ride in the morning." He went. She sat at the table for a while after the sound of his footsteps faded, with her paper in front of her and the stove ticking down and the silence pressing in around the kitchen walls. She thought about one suitcase and 3 years of moving from place to place and the particular careful distance she'd kept between herself and anything that felt like it could become necessary. She thought about walking the property in her first week, not because anyone told her to, because she needed to know where she was. She put the paper away and went to bed. The Millhaven sale started on a Wednesday and ran 3 days. Callum left before dawn on Wednesday with Pete and Arlo, driving 46 head down the trail in cold that the sun was slowly, reluctantly beginning to temper. The remaining crew kept the ranch running, fence maintenance, water management, the daily routines that didn't stop because the owner was away. Maren ran the kitchen. She also, on Wednesday afternoon, did something she hadn't done since her first week. She put on her coat and her boots and walked the full accessible property. Not because she needed to assess anything specific, because she needed to think, and walking was how she thought best. And the ranch had become familiar enough that she could walk it without paying full attention to where she was going and give the rest of her attention to the things that were taking up space inside her. She walked the western ridge above the irrigation channel. She stood at the point where the water came through and looked down at the pasture where the cattle were grazing on the first uncertain suggestions of spring grass, sparse and pale but present. She stood at the barn and looked at the patched roof and thought about Gus's professional dissatisfaction with the adequacy of it. She walked along the south fence that Pete and Brick had rebuilt in pieces over the past month. She stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the kitchen window, yellow with lamplight, even in the afternoon because the kitchen was always warm and the warmth showed. She thought about what Colum had said. "Mr. Rourke looks at you." She thought about a man who rinsed his coffee cup and walked property lines in a faded brown coat and apologized directly when he was wrong and had called this place home for long enough that it showed in every way he moved through it. She thought about the suitcase under her bed. She went back inside. She made supper for the remaining crew and ate in the kitchen and did her numbers and went to bed and slept solidly, which surprised her. And she thought on the edge of sleep that maybe the quality of sleep said something about what was happening inside her that she hadn't quite finished figuring out yet. Callum came back on Friday evening. She heard the horses and came to the kitchen door and watched them come in. Pete was grinning with the specific full-face grin of a young man who has spent 3 days in town and come back with money in his pocket and good news to deliver. Arlo had the quiet, satisfied look of a man whose expectations had been met. Callum dismounted and handed his horse to Colum and looked across the yard and found her in the kitchen doorway. He nodded once. She read the nod correctly. Sale went well, the news is good, and went back to the stove and put the coffee on. And by the time he'd gotten his boots off and his coat hung and come into the kitchen, she had a cup ready. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. 46 head at better than expected price, he said. The North Pasture question. You were right, by the way. It's worth keeping the best breeding stock and building from there. I kept 11 animals back that I'd planned to sell. What about Slade? She said. Something crossed his face. Not satisfaction, because he wasn't a man who wore satisfaction on his face. More like a door closing on something that had been open and uncomfortable for too long. Slade was there, he said. He tried to start the documentation conversation with two men from the county board who were at the sale. I had the records, all of them, all in order, all properly witnessed and filed. He paused. And 3 of the ranchers I've been doing business with for 5 years stood with me while I showed them. That was what you needed, Maren said. Aldridge was right, Callum said. Slade needed Iron Hollow to look isolated. One rancher against the county board, and a rich neighbor. He didn't account for 5 years of clean business relationships. Did he make any move with the board? He can still file, Callum said. But the board members who owe him favors are going to have a harder time moving on it when the documentation is public, and 3 respected ranchers have personally looked at it. He drank his coffee. It's not over. But the spring sale is done, and the money is real and the standing is real, Maren said. Yes, he said. All of that is real. He looked at her across the table. He said something, Callum said, and the way he said it made her go still. Slade. When I was talking to the ranchers, he came over. He made a point of coming over. And he said something about the cook at Iron Hollow being the one who'd talked him off the land deal in October. He paused. He said it the way he says everything, trying to make it sound like something it wasn't, like you'd manipulated the situation, like it reflected badly. Maren waited. Morrison, the rancher to the east of us, been in the county 30 years, looked at Slade and said, "A cook who can manage a ranch through a winter like this one is a cook worth keeping." Callum's voice was even. And then he turned back to the conversation as if Slade hadn't spoken. Maren was quiet for a moment. Morrison said that, she said. Morrison said that, Callum confirmed. She looked at her own cup, which she'd poured and not yet touched. People who do the work get seen, she said. Eventually. Yes, Callum said. They do. He finished his coffee. He stood. He did not immediately go to the basin. He stood at the table looking at her with the expression she'd categorized months ago as the look of a man evaluating something and trying to be honest about what he found. I want to ask you something, he said. She looked up. And I want you to answer me honestly, not the way you think I want it answered. That's the only way I answer, she said. He almost smiled. I know that. I'm asking anyway. He held her gaze. Are you thinking about leaving? The question landed in the kitchen the way certain things land, not loudly, but solidly, taking up space. Maren thought about it. She thought about the suitcase under the bed. She thought about the 3 years before Iron Hollow. She thought about what she'd said to Callum in the kitchen, weeks ago. I was coming there simply to cook. She thought about everything that had happened since then and how little of it she'd planned and how much of it had turned out to matter to her in ways she hadn't accounted for when she started. No, she said. Callum stood there for a moment. Okay, he said. The word was simple, and it carried something she didn't quite have a name for yet. He went to the basin and rinsed his cup and set it to dry. He went to the door. Good night, Maren, he said. Good night, she said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the first real suggestion of spring was somewhere in the air. Not warm, not by any honest measure, but something fractionally less cold, something that said the season was thinking about turning. The creek was running steady through the trench. The cattle were in the pasture. The barn roof was holding. Maren sat at her kitchen table with her paper in front of her and thought about the word no and how long it had been since she'd said it in answer to that kind of question without immediately qualifying it, without adding yet or but or for now. Just no. Just this place, this work, these people, this particular kitchen with its stubborn stove and its smoke-stained walls and the window that faced the yard where she could watch the things she needed to watch. She picked up her pencil. She started the next calculation. Spring came to Iron Hollow the way it always came to that part of Wyoming. Reluctantly, in stages, like a man walking back into a room he'd left angry and wasn't entirely sure he was ready to return to. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then the yard, then the pasture in patchy, uneven sections that made the land look uncertain of itself. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the channel Maren and the crew had dug in November carried it cleanly away from the buildings, which was no longer remarkable to anyone because it had been working long enough to seem like it had always been there. That was the nature of good work, Maren had found. When it held, people stopped noticing it. She noticed it. Every morning when she came out to check the flow before breakfast, she noticed it. Not with pride exactly, Pride was a thing that looked backward, and she was constitutionally oriented forward, but with the particular satisfaction of someone who had done a calculation correctly and then watched it stay correct over time. The barn roof also held. Gus had spent a good portion of the winter making dissatisfied sounds about its adequacy, and when the snow weight came and went without bringing the patch down, he had said nothing in acknowledgement of this, which was, Maren had learned, Gus's version of a standing ovation. The grass came back in the western pasture stronger than it had been in several years, which Pete announced at supper one evening as if he'd done it personally, which made Arlo snort into his coffee and made Colum laugh outright, which was a sound Maren had become fond of over the winter, young and uncomplicated, the laugh of someone who hadn't yet accumulated enough difficult years to make laughter cost something. Colum's ankle had healed. Properly this time, because Maren had been persistent enough about the rest requirement that even his 17-year-old determination to ignore the pain couldn't fully overcome it. He walked without the hitch now. She noticed the first morning it was gone, but didn't say anything, and he caught her noticing and didn't say anything either, and that mutual silence was its own small acknowledgement. It was in this gradually warming, slowly exhaling time that Vernon Slade made his final move. Maren had been expecting it. She'd said as much to Callum in March, and she'd held that expectation through April like you hold something you know is coming and can't exactly prepare for, but can at least refuse to be surprised by. Slade was patient, and he was calculating, and he had not, as far as anyone could tell, given up on Iron Hollow. He'd just gone quiet, which in her experience was what certain kinds of dangerous men did when they were finishing their thinking. On the second Tuesday of May, 2 county officials arrived at Iron Hollow with a formal notice of land license review. They were polite about it, stiff and official and careful, the way men are when they're doing someone else's work and have enough self-awareness to be slightly uncomfortable about it. They handed the notice to Hatch, who was in the yard when they arrived, and they explained that the review had been initiated based on questions about the documentation of Iron Hollow's eastern boundary grazing licenses, and that the review process would take between 60 and 90 days, and that in the meantime the licenses in question were technically in suspension. Hatch took the notice with a face that revealed nothing. He brought it to Maren, not to Callum. She wasn't sure afterward why he'd done that, whether it was habit by that point, or whether he'd wanted a few minutes with someone who would read it without the emotional weight that Callum would bring to it. She read it twice, folded it, and handed it back. "Where's Callum?" she said. "North pasture. He'll be back by noon." "Then let's have lunch ready when he gets here," she said. "Give him something to eat before we show him that." Hatch looked at her for a moment. "You're not rattled," he said. "I'm rattled," she said. "I'm cooking while I'm rattled. It's different." She made a proper lunch, not the quick midday meal she usually put together, but the kind of spread that required actual attention, the kind that communicated, without words, that the people eating it were worth the trouble. Roasted meat, proper bread, potatoes that had come in on the last supply wagon and were still good, a dried apple compote that used some of the stores she'd been protective of all winter. Callum came in from the north pasture and looked at the table and looked at her and said, "What happened?" "Eat first," she said. He ate. He didn't push, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He knew when something needed a few minutes to breathe before it could be addressed directly. When he was done, she set the notice in front of him. He read it. His face did the controlled tightening she'd seen before. He set the paper down. 60 to 90 days, he said. "Yes. And the eastern boundary licenses are the ones that cover the primary spring grazing." "I know," she said. "I read all your documentation when you brought it back from Mill Haven. I wanted to understand what we were working with." He looked at her. She had not mentioned reading his documentation before this moment, because there hadn't been a reason to. She'd done it the same way she'd walked the property in her first week and inventoried the stores in her second day. Because understanding the whole picture was how she operated, and she'd stopped apologizing for it sometime around December. "Tell me what you think," he said. "I think Slade picked the eastern boundary licenses specifically because they're the ones that would create the most immediate operational disruption. It's smart. The other licenses could be suspended and you'd feel it over time, but those ones—" She paused. "If you can't graze the eastern boundary in spring, where does the overflow herd go? You don't have enough room in the south and west pastures to absorb it. You'd have to reduce the herd size or find temporary grazing somewhere else." Reducing the herd now after winter losses, Callum started. You can't, Maren said. Not and maintain what you built at the spring sale. I sat with this. Morrison, she said. Callum looked up. You said he's been in this county 30 years, she said. You said he stood with you at the Millhaven sale. Does he have eastern grazing that he doesn't fully use in early spring before his own herd moves up? Callum was very still for a moment. He might, he said slowly. If he'd let you run part of the Iron Hollow herd on his eastern boundary for 60 days at a fair grazing fee, you could cover the suspension period without reducing herd size, she said. And you'd be asking a neighboring rancher for a practical business arrangement, not charity. Slade can't undermine that without looking like he's attacking working relationships that predate him in this county by 20 years. Callum looked at the notice. He looked at her. He's going to say I'm using Morrison, he said, that I'm hiding behind a neighbor. Let him say it, Maren said. A man who spent the winter trying to pick off scattered cattle and manipulate land boards doesn't get to decide what counts as legitimate business. Something in Callum's face shifted then. Not dramatically. Just a particular kind of settling, like a thing that had been slightly off balance finding its center. I'll ride to Morrison's tomorrow, he said. Today, Maren said. 60 days starts now. He rode to Morrison's that afternoon. He came back before dark with an agreement. 60 days, eastern boundary use, fair rate, no complications. Morrison had apparently listened to the situation with the particular steady attention of a man who has been in the territory long enough to recognize the pattern of what Slade was doing, and had said, according to Callum's account, I've seen Slade work before. Different ranch, different year. Didn't end well for the ranch. He'd shaken Callum's hand. That was the whole thing. Did he ask about me? Maren said. Callum paused at the kitchen door. He asked who'd figured out the Morrison solution. What did you tell him? The truth, Callum said. She wasn't sure what she felt about that. Something warmer than she had a practical use for. The 60-day review proceeded without drama, which was its own kind of victory. The county board, including the 2 members who owed Slade favors, found the Iron Hollow documentation complete, accurately filed, and correctly maintained. The eastern boundary licenses were reinstated. The notice was formally withdrawn in writing, which Callum had requested specifically in writing, and Maren had suggested he request because documents that existed could be pointed to, and documents that didn't were just words people remembered differently over time. The written withdrawal came on a Thursday in late June. Callum set it on the kitchen table when he came in that evening. Maren looked at it. She picked it up. She read it once, which was enough, and set it back down. Slade's not done, she said. No, Callum agreed, but this particular angle is done. He'll try something else. Probably, but he spent 2 seasons on Iron Hollow and hasn't moved it. He paused. That's a cost. Men like Slade calculate costs. She thought about this. You think he'll move on, she said. I think he'll move on to something that costs less, Callum said. There are other ranches in this county that are easier targets. That's not a comforting thought. No, he said, but it's an honest one. She appreciated that he didn't make it more comfortable than it was. Men who softened true things because they thought you needed protection from them were men who decided your ability to handle reality was limited, and Callum had never made that assumption about her. Not once. She realized, sitting in the kitchen in the early summer evening with the withdrawn notice on the table between them, that this was one of the things she'd built over the winter. Not just the channel and the winter stores and the livestock count. This specific thing, the understanding between 2 people who had worked alongside each other through something genuinely hard and had been honest with each other throughout it. That was, she thought, actually rarer than a properly dug irrigation trench. She folded the notice. I want to talk about the smokehouse, she said. He blinked. The smokehouse. There isn't one, she said. Not a real one. The setup behind the barn is inadequate for what this ranch needs. If I had a proper smokehouse, I could preserve enough meat coming out of summer butchering to cut the winter food vulnerability by probably 1/3. Maybe more. He was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since November, she said. I kept putting it in the column of things to address when we weren't in crisis mode. We're not in crisis mode, he said. Correct, she said. So, he leaned back in his chair. The lamp was warm. Outside, the first real summer dark was settling, soft and gradual, nothing like the hard winter dark that had pressed against the kitchen walls for months. A proper smokehouse would need, he started, brick or stone, not wood. Proper chimney damper, adjustable. Separate from the main buildings by at least 40 feet for fire safety. Big enough to handle a full beef in sections plus supplemental game. I've sketched it out. She slid a piece of paper across the table. He looked at the sketch. It was not artistic. It was accurate and dimensioned and annotated in her small, precise handwriting. He looked at it for a long moment. "Maren," he said. Something in his voice made her look up from the paper. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been cataloging since October and had never quite managed to fully name. The evaluating look, yes, but resolved now. Past evaluation, settled into something more certain. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to give you room to answer it any way you need to." She waited. "I want you to stay," he said, "not just as the cook. I've been building up to how to say this for a while, and I've decided that straightforward is probably what you'd want, so I want you to stay in a capacity that reflects what you actually do here, which is considerably more than cook. Housekeeper and household manager doesn't cover it. Ranch operations role with real authority doesn't quite cover it either." He paused. "I want you to have a position here that is yours, permanent, with wages that reflect it and land rights attached, so that it isn't dependent on my goodwill or any future change in circumstance." She looked at him. "Land rights," she said. "A parcel," he said. "Small eastern section near the ridge. It would be yours legally, not tied to your employment here." She sat with this. She understood what he was doing. He was making sure that the permanence he was offering was real permanence, not the kind that was only as good as the relationship, but the kind that held regardless. I was taking the one thing that had always made her circumstances fragile, the fact that everything she had came from someone else's continued goodwill, and removing it from the equation. He had thought about it carefully. He had thought about her specifically, about the shape of the thing she would need in order to be able to accept it. She felt something move in her chest that was more complicated than gratitude and more honest than anything she'd let herself feel in quite a long time. "I have a condition," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I won't be managed," she said. "The kitchen, the stores, winter planning, what I've been doing, I need actual authority. Not consultation, not recommendation. If I say we need to rebuild the supply approach, we rebuild it. If I say the barn needs attention before a storm, the barn gets attention." "Agreed," he said. "And if we disagree on something significant, we talk about it," he said, "the same way we've been talking about things all winter, and we figure out what's right, not what's convenient." She looked at him. "That's going to be complicated sometimes," she said. "Yes," he said. "I expect it will be." She almost smiled, not quite. But the suggestion of it was there, the edge, the same adjacency to a smile she'd seen on his face for months, and finally understood was the version of it she'd probably always get from him, and was, on reflection, enough. "All right," she said. He nodded once, the same nod she'd read in the yard when he came back from Mill Haven, the small, certain gesture that meant the decision was made and the thing was done. "I'll have the papers drawn up," he said, "for the land parcel." "I want to read them before I sign them," she said. "I wouldn't expect otherwise," he said. He stood, and for a moment he just looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she looked back, and there was something in the air between them that wasn't the winter crisis, and wasn't the practical business arrangement, and wasn't the careful professional distance that had structured so many of their conversations. It was quieter than all of that, more personal. "The smokehouse," he said finally. "I'll talk to Gus about materials." "Tell him stone," she said. "Not brick. Brick is cheaper, but stone holds temperature better, and I want it to last." He almost smiled. "Stone," he said, and went out. She sat at the kitchen table with the withdrawn license notice and the smokehouse sketch and her pencil and listened to the summer evenings settle around the ranch. Somewhere out beyond the yard, the creek ran through the channel. The cattle were in the pasture. The barn roof was holding. She thought about the woman who had arrived in September with one suitcase and no intention of depending on anyone, and she thought about how that had been, in its way, the truest thing about her. Not the not depending, but the intention of it, the way she'd organized her whole life around not needing things she was afraid she wouldn't be able to keep. "You could do that." You could keep yourself so mobile, so unattached, so ready to leave that nothing could take anything important from you because you'd never allowed anything to become important. And what you ended up with was one suitcase and a life that was survivable, but not much else. The suitcase was still under her bed. She thought she might move it, not throw it out. She was practical enough to know that you kept the vessel that had carried you even when you no longer needed to carry everything in it. But under the bed felt like a statement she was no longer making, a readiness she was no longer maintaining, and the space under the bed could hold other things. She folded the license notice and set it with the ranch records where it belonged. She picked up the smokehouse sketch and looked at it. Stone. Proper chimney damper, 40 feet from the main buildings. She'd been turning the dimensions over in her head since November, and she was fairly sure she had them right, but she'd want to walk the site and confirm before they broke ground, because assumptions that hadn't been ground-checked were just arithmetic that hadn't been tested yet. She would walk it tomorrow. The summer came on fully after that, warm and busy in the way of seasons that follow hard ones, slightly manic with growth, as if the land was making up for lost time. The grass in the western pasture came in thick, and the creek stayed high and useful through June, and the cattle that had survived the winter came out of it lean but fundamentally sound, which Pete said was a testament to the winter feeding, which made Arlo tell him to stop being dramatic, which made Colum laugh, which was still a sound Maren valued. Gus broke ground on the smokehouse in late June. He did it with the particular focused investment of a craftsman who has been given a project that is actually worth doing properly, which meant he was exacting about the stone selection and took 3 days longer than expected on the foundation and came to Maren twice with questions about internal dimensions that she answered from memory. And both times he went back to work without acknowledging that he'd come to her, but implementing exactly what she'd said, which she had come to understand was Gus's equivalent of a warm relationship. The smokehouse was finished in August. It was solid and square and built to outlast everyone who had any connection to its construction, which was what Maren had wanted. She stood in it on the day it was finished, in the particular quiet of a new space that hadn't been used yet, and ran her hand along the interior wall and thought, "This will be here after I am not." There was a comfort in that she hadn't expected. She had never built anything permanent before, had never stayed anywhere long enough to see something last, had spent 3 years moving through places that had no trace of her when she left because she'd been careful not to leave any, careful not to let her presence become something that could be noticed and then resented and then used as a reason to ask her to leave. Here she had dug a trench. Here she was looking at stone walls she'd dimensioned on a flour sack in November. She was, she realized, becoming part of the record of this place. Not in any grand way. In the way that practical things are part of records. The channel that redirected the water, the winter stores that fed 15 men, the smokehouse that would preserve food for winters she hadn't seen yet. You didn't need your name on something for it to be yours. You needed to have done it honestly and well and watched it hold. Slade resurfaced in September. Not at Iron Hollow this time. He appeared at the county assessor's office with a new filing, a boundary challenge on the western section, a narrow strip of land that abutted his own property. The challenge was technically legitimate, based on an original survey marker that was allegedly ambiguous, and it was the kind of thing that could have quietly dragged through legal process for a year and cost money Iron Hollow didn't need to spend. Maren heard about it from Callum the evening the filing arrived. She listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The original survey? Who conducted it?" "A man named Fielder. He's dead now, but were there witnesses to the survey?" she said. Documented witnesses? Callum thought. Hatch was there, and my father's foreman at the time, a man named Sutter. He moved east years ago, but is he findable? Probably. Get a statement from Hatch, in writing, witnessed, and find Sutter. A letter will do, doesn't need to be in person. She paused. The ambiguous marker, is there a physical marker or just documentation of one? Physical. Iron stake on the west ridge. Then we go look at it, she said, before anyone else does. They rode up to the western ridge the following morning, Callum and Maren and Hatch, in the early fall cold that was already suggesting winter's intentions. The iron stake was where it was supposed to be, sunk into the rocky ground at the base of an outcropping, stamped with the survey year. Maren crouched and looked at it. "There's nothing ambiguous about this," she said. Slade's filing says the location is inconsistent with the original survey notes, Callum said. Then the filing is wrong, Maren said, or dishonest, which we already knew. She stood up. Document the stake. Photographs if you can get them. Written description from all three of us witnessing today. Date and sign it. File it with the county before Slade's challenge has its first hearing. She looked at Callum. And get Morrison to write up here too. Third-party witness with no stake in the outcome. His statement will carry more weight than ours. You're thinking like a lawyer, Hatch said. I'm thinking like someone who has had landlords try to keep security deposits through creative interpretation of what the agreement actually said, Maren said. The mechanism is the same, the scale is different. Hatch made the sound that meant he was filing this information away. He made it a lot around Maren, she'd noticed. Morrison rode up 2 days later, looked at the stake, signed the witness document, and said, on his way back down, Slade's going to run out of angles eventually. That's what we're counting on, Callum said. The boundary challenge was heard in October and resolved in November, resolved in Iron Hollow's favor on the basis of the physical marker, the 3 witness statements, and Morrison's third-party attestation. Slade's filing was dismissed with a notation that the claim was not supported by available evidence. Dismissed with a notation, that was the language. Official, dry, irreversible. Callum brought the dismissal notice home and set it on the kitchen table without comment. Maren looked at it. She set it on top of the previous withdrawal notice, which she'd kept in the ranch records as documentation of the pattern. He might file again, she said. He might, Callum said. But he spent 2 years in money and 2 failed legal filings on Iron Hollow, she said. And the ranch is still here, and the relationships are intact, and the land records are cleaner and better documented than they've ever been because he forced us to make them that way. She paused. There are cheaper targets. Morrison said the same thing, Callum said. Morrison is right, she said. They sat with the dismissal notice between them, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the first snow of the new winter was falling, gentle this time, the kind that covered without threatening, that made everything quiet and still and slightly separate from itself. Maren looked at the snow through the window. She thought about October of the previous year, when she'd watched the same window looking for weather signs and running numbers in her head and telling herself, just get through today. She thought about what that version of herself had, and hadn't understood about what getting through today could eventually amount to. The smokehouse, she said. Callum looked at her. We're going to need it this winter, she said. I want to start curing before the temperature drops too hard. I'll need 2 of the men for 2 days to help with the initial processing. Pete and Brick, he said. They've done it before. Good. She pulled the new flour sack, she'd moved to proper paper months ago, but still thought of the accounting as the flour sack, and opened it. I want to talk about the spring store's order. I've been working on a purchasing approach that coordinates with Morrison's operation, so we can share wagon costs on the heavier supplies. It saves both ranches money and means neither of us is fully dependent on a single supply run if the trail is bad. Callum looked at her. You talked to Morrison about this? His foreman, she said. Last month, when he was in Millhaven. It was a preliminary conversation. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't mention it, he said. It wasn't certain enough to mention, she said. Now it's certain enough. She looked up. Is that a problem? He held her gaze. There was something in his eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but occupied the territory between them. No, he said. It's not a problem. Good, she said, and went back to the paper. They sat like that for a while, her working through the spring order, him reading the grazing assessment Hatch had put together, the snow falling outside the window, the stove doing what it did, the ranch settling into its winter quiet around them. Not a romantic quiet and not a merely functional one. Something more lived in than either. The quiet of 2 people who had been through something real together and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it that was not dramatic and not perfect and was, for exactly those reasons, genuinely theirs. Maren put down the paper at some point and said, "The suitcase." Callum looked up. "I moved it," she said, "from under the bed. It's in the storeroom." He looked at her for a moment. "Good place for it," he said. She nodded. Outside, the snow was the soft kind. The kind that didn't threaten anything, just covered it gently and held it. And in the morning would be beautiful in the unsentimental way that beauty was when it was also just weather. There would be calculations tomorrow. There were always calculations, stores and margins and weather, and the ongoing arithmetic of keeping a place alive through seasons that didn't ask whether you were ready for them. There would be cold mornings and difficult decisions, and days when the numbers didn't work the way she wanted, and days when the stove backed up, and days when things went wrong in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had stopped trying to get ahead of all of it. You couldn't. The most you could do was pay attention and know what you had, and do the math honestly, and be the kind of person who showed up at 4 in the morning when something needed doing and didn't make it into more than it was. She had shown up. That was the whole of it, and it turned out to be enough. She picked up her pencil and went back to the spring order, and Callum went back to the grazing assessment, and the kitchen was warm, and the ranch was standing, and the snow kept falling outside the window like it had somewhere to be and had decided to take its time getting there. The stove made its small sounds. The work continued. Iron Hollow held.